Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the March update for the Spring Hydrologic Outlook. Once again, this is Chris Foltz from National Weather Service Central Region Headquarters. Today's briefing will be a review and an update of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and the Great Lakes drainages. As always, additional information and forecasts can be found at www.weather.gov. Today's presenters are Mike Welvert from the North Central River Forecast Center, Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, Lee Crowley from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grushel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. Once again, we are recording this webinar, and we'll send a follow-up email hopefully later this afternoon with information on how to access the recording for those who were unable to attend. If you do have any trouble, I did just about 5 minutes ago send out a PDF version of the slides. So if you happen to have any trouble viewing them, or if you're not at a computer where you have access to GoToWebinar, you do have the PDF of the slides there in your email, hopefully. So if you are in the webinar and you have any trouble with the slides not advancing, try closing and reopening the webinar. That should hopefully fix the problem. If you have any questions, we are going to hold any questions until the end, as we did 2 weeks ago. We do have that question box there in the GoToWebinar GUI, or you can raise your hand in that same area and we'll get you at the end of the briefing. With that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike Welvert to begin the presentation for today.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone to this update after we had our discussion 2 weeks ago. A few things have changed and we'll talk about those today. First of all, look back at the temperatures through the winter, going back to last December 1st. Overall, across the upper Mississippi Basin here, throughout the whole basin, in fact, it was colder than normal, as much as 1 to 5 degrees below normal for most of the region, with the exception of the upper Missouri Basin, where it was as much as 4 to 8 degrees below normal through the winter 3-month period. If we zoom in just to February itself, a little bit more opposite. It was very cold out in Montana and the upper part of the Missouri River Basin and in the Dakotas, where temperatures were as much as 20 to 22 degrees below normal for the month of February. But it was rather warm east of a line from Louisiana up to Michigan, temperatures running as much as 2 to 9 degrees above normal in those areas. Taking a look at precipitation through the winter months, the central part of the basin was at or below its normal precipitation for that 3-month period. The exceptions being in the upper Missouri Basin, in the mountainous areas of Montana and Wyoming, where there was quite a bit of extra precipitation, as much as 2 to 3 times what we would expect to see. It was a little bit above normal in the Great Lakes, but it was also above normal from the Arkansas and Louisiana areas up through the Ohio River Valley and toward the eastern part of the Great Lakes. If we look at just February itself, again, that dryness is very evident from the Texas-Oklahoma Panhandle region across Kansas, but it was also very wet and snowy, I guess, in Montana and Wyoming and up in that area, with as much as 3 to as much as 5 times the normal amount of precipitation for the month of February up there. It was also well above normal precipitation in a broad swath from Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, up through the Ohio Valley and up toward the northeast, including the eastern part of the Great Lakes. And in that area, there was a good deal of flooding recently, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. As far as snowfall goes, mainly the above normal areas were in the mountains up in the upper Missouri Basin and also in the eastern Great Lakes. The snow now has pretty much left the area due to all the warm temperatures we've had in the last couple of weeks. Snow water content, this is a comparison of what we saw from 2 weeks ago when we had our last update. February 15th, the image on the left shows the snow water equivalent that was on the ground at that time. There was a band of some snow running from Nebraska through Iowa, across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin and into Michigan. But as you can see on the update we had here earlier this week, that snow is pretty much all gone now. We have had a couple of systems that have brought additional snows to the eastern part of Montana, through South Dakota and into Minnesota. So the snow water equivalent is a little bit better in those areas. But again, there's a lack of snow water content and lack of snow south of a line from northern Nebraska through northern Iowa and up through Wisconsin. The only snow left in Michigan now is in the very northwest part of lower Michigan in the lake effect areas. Soil moisture across the region. We still have the very dry conditions from northeast Montana across North Dakota and into northwest Minnesota. That's been persistent now for a couple of years. A dry area through Kansas, central part of the country, but much wetter now, as you can see, running from the Texas, Louisiana area through Arkansas and Mississippi up through the Ohio Valley and into the Great Lakes region as well as the Northeast. If you look at a comparison to the map we looked at 2 weeks ago, which is on your left, you'll see that bullseye of very dry conditions across Missouri, and that's pretty much all gone now thanks to rain we've had here in the last 2 weeks. Drought status. Here is the latest drought update that was issued yesterday. The dryness is still focused up in the Dakotas, where there's been very little change recently. Also still quite dry from the desert southwest, stretching into the Texas, Oklahoma regions and up across Kansas, and still extending into Missouri and southeast Iowa. Although the area noted with the blue circle, there has been some improvement thanks to storm systems that have traveled through that area in the last 2 weeks. Unfortunately, that's also the area where we've experienced some flooding. Here's the outlook through the month of March. This is the tendency that we're looking for over the next month. And as you can see, there's an improvement in the drought conditions, as we already noted on the last slide, expected through the Arkansas Basin as well as the lower Mississippi Basin and stretching up through Missouri and into Illinois, where there was previously some drought and some dryness. That now is improving greatly. Still persistent drought expected to linger in the Dakotas, perhaps a little improvement in Montana, but still very dry conditions up in that area. Streamflow conditions, according to the U.S. Geological Survey gauges, you can see all the blue and black dots there are noting flow that's well above normal for this time of year, and that also depicts very well where all the rain has fallen in the last couple of weeks. In the area from Texas, Oklahoma up through Kansas and northern Missouri, you can see a lot of the green, orange, and red dots, which indicate normal or even below normal flows continuing in those areas, and that also is depicted well by the drought maps we just looked at. There is some ice still in the northern states, and that is why there's really no dots up there. Those rivers are still frozen up to the point where flow cannot be accurately determined, so they don't include those notes at this time. Ice jam action has been pretty minimal so far this winter, although it does remain possible until we get the melt complete. So let's take a look now what's going to happen in the future. First of all, we'll look at the precipitation over the next 7 days. This takes us through the 8th of March. Overall, over the west, still not expected to be very active through the next week. The active storm track will continue to run from eastern Texas up through Louisiana, Arkansas, into the Ohio, Tennessee valleys, and up into the northeast, including the Great Lakes region. Most of the precipitation through the next 7 days is going to be running in that general path. Looking out 2 weeks, running from March 8th through the 14th, the outlook is calling for cooler than normal conditions to continue across the northwest and stretching into Montana and the Dakotas. Also a little bit cooler than normal from the Ohio Valley back toward Missouri, Arkansas areas. As far as precipitation goes, still running a little bit above normal. The guidance is suggesting that it will be above normal precipitation in those areas, although perhaps a little less precipitation in the Great Lakes region and also up across Montana, and as well as the Texas, Oklahoma Panhandle region. For the entire month of March, here's the outlook that was updated today or yesterday. Still expected to be cool for the whole month of March from the Pacific Northwest into the Montana and Dakotas area, although the temperatures are expected to inch a little bit above normal through the rest of the Mississippi Basin. As far as precipitation goes, two main storm tracks, one running along the international border, keeping the above normal chances running up there, and also the storm track running from the Texas Gulf up through the Ohio Valley to the northeast, keeping that area above normal through the month of March. And if we take that out 3 months, the overall trend is expected to be below normal, continuing along the international border, and above normal temperatures running from the southwest into the lower Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio Valley. And the precipitation also looks to be above normal along the northern tier states into the Great Lakes region and Ohio Valley. Here's the latest flood outlook. And if you look at this map across the entire Mississippi drainage, generally there is a lower than normal flood risk for most of the region, especially in the northwest third of the region. The green squares indicating about a normal flood risk or less than 50% chance of flooding. Anywhere you see an orange or red, you're looking at an above normal chance for flooding. The purple as well, the possibility of reaching major flood stage. So from this map, you can see pretty easily where it's been raining recently. The greater risk for flooding looks to be over the lower Mississippi Basin, the Arkansas Basin, and stretching up through the Ohio Valley. Moderate to major flooding is possible in these areas. So in conclusion, for a summary of the basin, the risk for flooding from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio Valley and down through the lower Mississippi Valley looks the most prevalent. Drought persisting for North Dakota as well as the Kansas-Missouri area, but improving across the middle and lower Mississippi region. And just for fun, I threw on this map of the spring leaf index showing the vegetation states. Anywhere you see in red there is running about 1 to 2 weeks early for vegetative growth. And anywhere you see the lighter shades of blue, looks like the vegetation is delayed maybe 1 to 2 weeks in those areas. So now we'll zoom in a little bit, and I'll start out with looking at specifically the North Central River Forecast Center area. And we'll start with the snow water content across the area. This was taken just a couple of days ago and depicts where the amount of water content in the snow is. And we've had some recent snow across the Dakotas through Minnesota and into northern Wisconsin, as I mentioned. Snow water equivalent in this area running from 1 to 4 inches across Minnesota and Wisconsin, with those highest values running up near the Great Lakes region. Some snow water amounts greater than 6 inches look like they're in the Minnesota Arrowhead region as well as up into the upper peninsula of Michigan. The warmer temperatures and the rain events we had earlier this week and also last week have eliminated the snow further to the south. Here's a satellite picture that was taken a couple days ago as well that really depicts where the snow is across the region. There are a few clouds in there, as you can probably see, but overall, much of the picture there is indicating snow, and you can see the snow in the mountains, and you can also see the line where there is snow versus where there is no snow running across northern Nebraska, northern Iowa, cutting through Wisconsin, and only catching the northwest part of lower Michigan. Pretty clear picture of where the snow is at this point. So comparing from 2 weeks ago where the snowpack was, 2 weeks ago we had much more snow running from Nebraska through Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and into Michigan. And as I mentioned, the warm temperatures and the rain we had recently has pretty much gotten rid of all that snow now. There's really nothing left on the ground there, as you could see in that satellite picture I just showed. Frost across the region where the warm temperatures and rain have occurred. The frost, there's very little left, anywhere from 0 inches to 3 inches where the red symbols are. Further to north, up across North Dakota into Minnesota and Wisconsin, a lot more of the blue colors and even a few in the magenta colors there, indicating 2 to as much as 4 or maybe 5 feet of frost depth in those areas due to the cold temperatures that we had, especially in late January into February, and also because there's very little snow up there for quite a while which would serve as an insulator, keeping that cold air from driving into the ground. Where we did have some snow cover, you can see in Minnesota and Wisconsin, the green and even yellow symbols there indicating the frost depth 1 to 2 feet there. So there definitely is some frost in the ground. This is a snapshot of where we were yesterday in the North Central River Forecast Center with regards to how much flooding was happening. Anywhere you see the green, there was no flooding, but if you see any of the other colors, orange, red, and purples, that's where we were seeing some of the flooding in our areas. We did have record flooding from the rainfall across southern Michigan through northwest Indiana and into northeast Illinois. That rain and snow melt that caused the flooding is now moving downstream, working its way toward the Mississippi River. So taking a look at the flood potential across the North Central River Forecast Center region, first we'll start up in the Hudson Bay Basin, rivers that drain northward into Canada. For the Souris River and also the Devil's Lake basins, we're looking at a below normal flood risk in those areas. owing to mostly the dry conditions leading into the winter season, and really not a great deal of snow cover up there, so a below normal risk there. For the Red River Valley itself, running along the Dakotas and Minnesota border, the risk is considered normal when you take into account snowpack, frost in the ground, and future precipitation. In the Great Lakes area, we're considering most of the flood risk in this area normal, perhaps a bit below normal for a few locations. The only real concern we have for above normal flood risk looks to be running from southern and especially southwest Michigan through the the northwest part of Indiana, where we've had that recent flooding, and they'll be susceptible now for at least another month. And for the upper Mississippi Basin itself, we're considering it about a normal flood risk for this spring. When you take into account the snow that's in place now and the frost, as well as future precipitation over the next 3 months, looking at the risk being about normal for most of the area. The only places we're concerned with above normal potential is running along the main stem Mississippi River, as well as some of the tributaries in Illinois, including northwest Indiana, where we've had that recent heavy rainfall, and those rivers will continue to run high for quite some time here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Knoll in the Ohio River Forecast Center.
All right there. Thanks, Mike. And kind of as we talked about 2 weeks ago, we were expecting some events to be moving through the Ohio Valley, creating minor to moderate flooding, and we couldn't rule out major flooding. And that's kind of what has happened. We've actually had 3 events over the last few weeks. The first event started out on February 9th to 11th in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, and then it spread to a second event from February 15th to 19th in the upper Ohio Basin, really from like Pittsburgh down through Marietta. And all of these events created moderate flooding and even some isolated major flooding. And then, of course, our big event started around February 21st and is continuing in the Ohio Basin right now. And all those red dots on there are significant flooding, at least moderate levels, and some are very close to major levels there in the lower Ohio Basin, southwest Indiana, southeast Illinois, and western Kentucky. We're also expecting some heavy rain here today. It's mixing with snow even in northern Indiana, northern Ohio, and so we will likely see a little bit of renewed flooding in those areas of northern Indiana, northern Ohio, possibly even northwest Pennsylvania over the next day or two. If we go to the next slide, not a lot has changed from our last briefing, except a little bit more darker reds just because now we've gotten a lot wetter. We are expecting not only from this event, but really even going through March and especially into April, we're going to get renewed flooding again in the Ohio River Basin. So we are expecting pretty widespread minor to moderate flooding across the Wabash, Little Wabash, White, and Maumee River Basins in Indiana and Illinois. And that'll be from the current flooding and then renewed flooding here late March into April, we're thinking again. Further to the south and western Kentucky, we're expecting pretty widespread minor to moderate flooding to not only occur now, but then they redevelop as we go either later March or April. Especially in the Green and Kentucky River Basins, with minor flooding expected across portions of the Licking and Cumberland basins. Further to the northeast in Ohio, we are expecting minor flooding in the Maumee, Muskingum, and Lake Erie watersheds, and we've also added the Scioto Basin for some renewed flooding as we go through springtime. And we're also expecting some minor flooding in West Virginia in the Monongahela and Little Kanawha basins. And again, we do expect areas of minor to moderate flooding in especially the lower half of the Ohio River Basin this spring, including the Ohio River itself. So say from about Port Smith, Cincinnati area downstream, minor to moderate flood is still possible again. Upstream, it's a little more uncertain on what we'll see going into the springtime. If we go to the next slide, just wanted to highlight the lower left slide is kind of what our special ensemble forecast or our different outcomes of river forecasts for the whole volume of the Ohio River. This was 2 weeks ago, and it forecast this event. And the bigger slide, the bigger image on the right is the actual event that's occurring now in the lower Ohio. This is at Smithland or downstream of Evansville, Indiana. And so that crest is going to be occurring here around March 5th or 6th. And you can see that there's a big drop-off coming, around March 15th, the middle of the month. But the thing to highlight here is that red line is the most likely solution, and we're expecting some kind of bottom in the middle of March with an increase into late March and April again. And the red line is what we're kind of thinking is likely to happen. The green solid line to the below that is what normal conditions are. So the event that we're having right now in the lower Ohio Basin is about 3.5 times normal. And we expect some kind of an event to occur either later March or April that probably will be around twice the normal. So the bottom line is the flood risk does remain elevated in the Ohio Basin at least through April. But we think that maybe the biggest event is the one occurring now for the Ohio Basin. But we are likely to have another event here down the road. And if you go to our final slide to kind of summarize the Ohio and Cumberland River Basin, flooding remains above normal. That flood risk for all but the upper Ohio Basin. We are expecting minor to moderate flooding, and some major flooding has already occurred. And we are thinking that the current flood may be the biggest one for the Ohio Basin upstream of Smithland, which would also be upstream of Paducah, Kentucky. But we are expecting more minor to moderate flooding to redevelop after the current flooding decreases across the Ohio and Cumberland Basin. And that would occur probably the second half of March or April, we're thinking. And then an overall decrease in the flood threat for the Ohio and Cumberland Basins once we get into May. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin at the Kansas City River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim. Flood risk for this spring varies across the Missouri Basin. This first graphic that I'm showing is intended to depict the comparison of the probability to reach flood stage this spring as compared to the modeled historical probability of reaching flood stage. And so this graphic in and of itself does not show whether we expect a location to actually make it to flood stage or not. It simply shows where conditions are more favorable. Cool colors, blues and greens, indicate a reduced risk for flooding, and warm colors, yellows and oranges, indicate an increased risk for flooding as compared to normal. I've went ahead and drawn in some general areas to show you, based on the preponderance of the colors of the dots, where we have enhanced flood risk and reduced flood risk. And so much of the basin has either a normal or even a reduced risk to incur flooding this spring. And that seems reasonable given that much of the basin has abnormally dry soils, and about 30% of the basin is classified as being in drought. The northern mountainous areas, as well as the plains of Montana, have an enhanced risk for flooding as compared to normal, and that's due to the above average snowpack in the northern Rockies as well as in eastern Montana. Going to the next slide, we'll look in particular at the mountains. The left-hand slide here shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of normal snow water equivalent. Mountain snowpack is above normal for the upper Missouri above Fort Peck, the Milk Basin, and the Yellowstone River Basin. The Platte system isn't doing as well, with the North Platte headwaters being slightly below normal with regard to snowpack, and the South Platte being well below normal. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent, and so the final picture of the mountainous snowpack is coming into focus. On the right side of the slide, I'm showing a summary graphic of the February water supply forecast issued by our office in early February, and this forecast is for conditions as of February the 1st, and so it's currently a month old. And I apologize for that, but the data is now coming in, and we'll be updating this graphic over the next week. But the February water supply forecast, as you see on the right side, suggested a slightly above average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the upper Missouri and the Yellowstone, and a slightly below average year for the North Platte and a below average year for the South. But again, this information will be updated within the next 10 days. And I do suspect that our numbers will be going up for the Yellowstone and upper Missouri, but remaining largely unchanged for the Platte system. On the next slide, we'll turn to the plains snowpack, and as has already been stated, plains snowpack in the Missouri Basin is widespread, but rather shallow. And the primary exception to this shallow descriptor is the plains of eastern Montana, where we have snow water equivalents as high as 5 inches, but generally in the 2 to 4 inch range. And as we move towards warmer spring temperatures, we'll need to closely monitor how this plains snowpack in eastern Montana melts off. The extent and the severity of any resulting flooding will be based on how fast we do warm up, the diurnal swings between daytime and nighttime temperatures, whether we have an appreciable rain on top of snow event, and also the complication of river ice action. But we do have some concern about eastern Montana. Moving then to the next slide, I'll now go area by area throughout the Missouri Basin, highlighting those watersheds where our long-range outlooks indicate a better than 50-50 chance of seeing minor flooding. Now, while we don't expect widespread significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone, we are projecting some minor flooding in some of the basins in the mountains. Minor flooding is likely along the Sun, Boulder, and Clarks Fork Yellowstone rivers in Montana. And we'll also likely see flooding along Clear Creek as well. And we will be watching the Little Bighorn River for minor flooding. In Wyoming, we could see minor flooding along the Wind River. Moving eastward with the next slide, minor flooding is possible along the Little Sioux River in northwest Iowa. And then finally, we'll move southward and consider the lower portion of the Missouri Basin with the states of Kansas and Missouri. Over the past 2 weeks, a couple of rounds of rainfall has already resulted in minor to moderate flooding in the state of Missouri. And this is an excellent example of where we have a reduced risk from normal for flooding, and yet we still had flooding. And as we move forward into the spring, we will continue to see episodic flooding in the lower portion of the Missouri Basin due to rounds of anticipated convective activity. Specifically, we are projecting minor flooding along the Platte and Sheraton rivers in Missouri and the Missouri River itself downstream of Nebraska City. We expect to see moderate level flooding in the Grand and the Osage River basins, and also along the Tarkio in Missouri, and along many of the smaller tributaries in the state of Missouri. Moving to the state of Kansas, we're calling for minor flooding in the southern portion of the Big Blue and in the Meridocene Basin. And moderate level flooding is projected along Stranger Creek and within the Osage River Basin in Kansas. And now moving on to my final slide and the summary slide. Snowpack in the northern Rockies is above normal, and the Platte system is below normal. In general, plain snowpack should not be a player this year, with the exception of eastern Montana, where the plain snowpack is beginning to be somewhat of a concern. The dry fall and winter and the general lack of plains snow has led to reduced risk for flooding across the Dakotas and the eastern and southeastern portions of the basin. However, as we have just seen over the past few days within the state of Missouri, even with a reduced risk for flooding, flooding can still occur. We expect some minor flooding due to the large mountain snowpack, and we expect flooding to occur in the lower portion of the basin due to springtime thunderstorm activity. And as always, there is the potential for ice jams due to ice breakup along the northern rivers. And this year we have what I believe to be an increased potential for this. Thank you, and this concludes the flood potential brief for the Missouri Basin. And I will now turn the presentation over to Lee in the Arkansas Red River Basin.
Thank you, Kevin. The ABRFC has had significant changes over the past 2 weeks with respect to precipitation. As seen in the precipitation graphic in the lower right, much of the southeastern third of the basin received anywhere from 5 to 15 inches of rainfall over the past 14 days. This has pretty much erased any drought conditions in this area. The heavy rainfall produced minor to major flooding at several locations, but this is not the case in the northwest portion of our basin. However, as the snow water equivalent in the Arkansas River Basin of Colorado has only grown by a couple of percent in the last 2 weeks. The NRCS graphic in the upper left shows the snow water equivalent at 65% of normal. Southwest Kansas, northeast New Mexico, and the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles also remain very dry. Moving to the next slide, we see the current short-range forecast status of some of our rivers. Some of the tributaries of the Arkansas River are still in or forecast to reach minor flood, but they should fall below flood stage by next week. Soils are saturated across the eastern third of our basin, and most rivers will generally remain high as reservoirs begin to release water they are holding in flood storage. Next slide, please. Speaking of the reservoirs, the past rainfall did cause numerous lakes to utilize their flood storage capabilities and help mitigate the flooding that did occur. There are still several reservoirs that are using more than 50% of their flood storage. The Corps of Engineers, which has done a great job with this event, has begun releasing some of this excess water, where possible, to regain flood storage to capture excess runoff from future events. In summary, on our final slide, we are continuing with a below normal flood risk in the Arkansas River Valley in Colorado because of a lesser snowpack. Elsewhere, as was seen over the past 2 weeks, the presence of even extreme drought conditions does not preclude our area from flooding during the spring. We know most of the spring flooding in our area occurs with convective rainfall systems. These events can be forecast well in the short term, but not so much in the long term of more than a week. This is why the remainder of the ABRFC will stay with a normal flood risk into May. And with that, I will pass it along to Jeff Grashel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, Lee. Just like Lee had mentioned, 2 weeks we've had a big difference in soil moisture conditions across our area, and even as of last night, getting 2 to 4 inches of rainfall over portions of Arkansas, northeast Texas, and extending eastward into Tennessee. Very wet conditions for really a large portion of the lower Mississippi Valley area. Next slide. Next slide kind of shows you the flood storage availability, and as you would expect, the areas that have gotten tremendous amounts of rainfall over the last 2 weeks, we've actually gotten into surcharge for a couple of our locations on the Yazoo at Arkabutla, Jim Chapman on the Red, and we'll probably approaching, if not maybe get the surcharge for a couple of our reservoirs in the Ouachita Basin itself. Our other areas, though, do have plenty of flood storage, but hopefully over the next few weeks, as we get a little drier conditions, we'll be able to say that the flood storage availability will be a little bit better for a number of these locations as we go into the next few weeks. Next slide. As you would expect with all the rainfall, the stream flows from the USGS are showing that just about everywhere is much above to very high. Probably the only exception to be in the very southeast parts of our basin. And the final slide. So kind of really just sum everything up, we got major flooding, moderate to major flooding occurring right now in the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. That's really going to continue here for almost the remaining month. We won't get cresting conditions down to the Baton Rouge and New Orleans area to probably the 3rd or 4th week of March. So we'll have elevated conditions on the main stem of the river for probably at least the next 2 months, depending on what we see here over the next month or two. Will depend on whether we can get back to what we call more normal conditions. Probably won't happen until we get into May. Other areas of concern, or at least that we'll have to watch here over the next several months, are the Ouachita Basin in Arkansas. We'll also need to be watching the Yazoo River Basin and the Big Black Basins in Mississippi. Also the Calcasieu Basin, Red, and Ouachita Basins in Louisiana. And then finally, some of our tributaries going into the Tennessee River, especially in the western and middle, especially the western portion of Tennessee, but the middle portions of Tennessee that goes in the Tennessee River. Things are pretty elevated there right now just from the current rainfall that we've had overnight. Really the only area that we don't have much in the way of threats at this moment, and probably you're just looking at seasonal flooding, will be just the southeast parts of Louisiana and Mississippi. And with that, that concludes the lower Mississippi Basin, and I will turn it over to Mike.
All right, thanks everyone for the updates. Just in summary across the basin now, the above normal flood risk looks like it's in the southeast part of our region, including the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the lower Mississippi River basins. Also up in Montana and Wyoming in the upper Missouri Basin. Normal flood risk exists for much of the region, especially the Red River of the North, the Great Lakes, the upper Mississippi, the upper Ohio, the middle and lower portions of the Missouri, the Arkansas Basin except for in Colorado, and also the Red River Basin, and a below normal flood risk expected for the Souris and Devil's Lake basins up in North Dakota. As always, the National Weather Service will continue to monitor any flood risk across the region. And with that, I'll pass it back to Chris at Central Region Headquarters.
All right, Mike, appreciate it. And thanks to all of you guys for your updates for your respective areas. Right now we have 0 questions. So obviously I think you guys did a good job, but certainly if someone has a question, they're more than welcome to reach out to either you or to their local National Weather Service office to address those questions after we get off the call here. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today, for jumping in on this call. Again, we did record this webinar, and I'm hoping to get this sent out this afternoon in the next 30 minutes or so, a link to where you can go view it. It'll be a YouTube link. This will be the last scheduled brief for the spring, but again, additional briefings could be scheduled on a localized basis if necessary, if conditions change substantially. Did want to remind you again, additional information and additional forecast information specifically is available at weather.gov, and want to wish everybody a great afternoon. Have a good day.